Hi everybody, this is the start of our summer holiday. We've just got on the boat and I'm installing here my brand new Torqeedo 2.0. 2 days in Pin Mill, we've charged the battery to about 3/4 charge and we're about to go off north. Not quite sure where to, we're on our way to Newcastle. It's about 5:45, we've just pulled up the anchor. We're going along with about 700 watts of power and we're doing nearly 5 knots, although we will have a bit of tide with us. Okay, so we're heading into wind now in order to get out from Pin Mill. We're using over 1,000 watts, which is the most I've ever used, and we're going at just 3.6 knots. It's the middle of the day. We're in Wells Harbour here, and we're about to set sail for Newcastle. So there's Wells Harbour in the background. We're motoring along with the Torqeedo at about 1 kilowatt. We're going directly into wind and into the tide a little bit, and we're doing between 2 and 2.5 knots. Okay, we're a little further on. I'm going to power it up a little bit. I'm going to go for 1.5 kilowatts. You can hear it speeding up there. So still going 1,500 watts. We're doing around about 3 knots. We've got 10 knots of wind pretty much dead ahead and a little bit of tide. In fact, as we get to the entrance we get a bit more tide going against us. Tide's slightly less here as we turn the corner and we're going about 3.5 knots now and still with about 10 knots of wind against us. We're leaving Wells behind now. We've got about 7-8 knots of wind and we're making 2.5, sometimes a bit more, knots. We've got about 400 watts of Torqeedo going, and that's helping us make this, otherwise we make under 2 knots. The wind's dropped down very low now. It even says there's no wind at all. We've got 400 watts or so going in. We're still doing 2.8 knots. That's because the sea's a lot flatter now. And the wind's from behind us when it does blow. So we're still staying at nearly 3 knots. And time to let the batteries recharge now in the last of the afternoon sun. Okay, the Torqeedo's down now, so we'll start it up. Let's set it to 400 watts. So we were doing 1 knot, we're now doing between 2.5 and 3 knots. We've still got hardly any wind. We've got very calm seas though. But it seems as though about 400 watts of Torqeedo speeds us up by between 1.5 and 2 knots. So I've gone up to 700, 800 watts and we're doing between 3.3 and 3.5 knots. We've got no wind at all now. But it seems as though adding 400 watts increases our speed by about 3/4 of a knot. Right, that's the entrance to Newcastle Harbour there. The sun's just risen and the wind's dropped off to around 6 knots. So I'm going to start Torqeedo. We've got 2.5, 3 knots of wind. Our Torqeedo going out about 450 watts, keeping up 3.6 knots, but the tide is with us. And we're heading for the entrance in between those 2 lighthouses, particularly to get there before this boat does. So we've just entered the harbour. We've got 7 knots of wind ahead of us, maybe a knot or so of tide. We're doing 2.6 knots now. It's just gone 1:30 in the morning. We're about to set off from Newcastle for the Farne Islands, for Lindisfarne. I'm just about to hoist the anchor and then go out through the harbour entrance there. Just passing the harbour entrance here. We had very little wind in the harbour, so we've been on the Torqeedo with about 400 watts to come out here, and that's kept us going about 2.5 knots. I'll put the Torqeedo on now. It's sped us up by about a knot, from 2 knots to 3 knots. And we've got 400 to 500 watts going through. Nearly 11 o'clock. We're entering the channel in between the mainland and Farne Islands, and the wind's dropped off almost to nothing. It says 4.9 knots here, but actually we're doing 4 knots of that. So we've got 600 watts of Torqeedo going. We've probably got about a knot of tide here, and when we get into the Narrows we should get up to 2 knots of tide because we've arrived here early enough. And then about 5 nautical miles further is Holy Island. Here we are entering Holy Island. We've got 1,500 watts of Torqeedo going, 2.8 knots, and that's because we've got 18 knots of wind, 17 knots of wind ahead of us. Hi, it's midnight. It's so dark, you can see the Milky Way. And we're about to set off from Lindisfarne to go to Scotland. Well, it's 3:30 in the morning now, and the sun's just starting to rise. And you can see it there. We were going along at about 6 knots back there with 18 knots of wind, fairly close hauled. But now the wind's dropped off to almost nothing, so I've turned the Torqeedo on. It's at 3.3 knots at the moment. It's not helping us much at all. And we've got the tide against us. So I put the Torqeedo on to 500 watts, and we're going along at about 2.5 knots. Hi, it's about 10 to 5 in the morning. We're in Stonehaven Harbour, and we're about to go off to Peterhead. It's about 36 nautical miles. That's Stonehaven disappearing in the background. We've got 800 watts going in, and we're going at just over 3 knots on a very flat sea. I'm going to put the sails up soon, but there's hardly any wind, so I'm not sure it'll do much good. So we've just passed the Skerries here. There's quite some eddy currents going around that, so I turned it up to 700 or so, and we're now moving at 2.5 knots, although we've been going between about 2 and 3 knots depending on how fast the currents have been against us. We're just about to come out of it now, and then we'll be about a mile away from the harbour entrance. So we've come out of the currents here. We've gone down to 600 to 700 watts, and we're doing 2.8, nearly 3 knots. And there's the entrance. It's 4:45 in the morning, an hour later than I intended because for some reason my alarm didn't go off, and we're just casting off to leave Peterhead for Lossiemouth. Very calm here, but hopefully there's a bit of wind out at sea. Spinning around here and about to go out of the harbour. The harbour master asked us to get our best speed out of here, and our best speed at 600 watts is nearly 3 knots. I think 3 knots is okay. Turn it up a little bit. There's the marina disappearing behind us. Got the entrance to the outer harbour here we're just about to go through. We've got 800 watts going on and 3.2 knots. So we'll be out of the harbour in about a minute. And I've just put the mainsail up, although there's no wind in here at the moment. It's coming up to 6:30. There's still very little wind out here, although it's helping us a bit. We're getting at just over 3 knots. I've turned the Torqeedo up a bit now, and that's so that we make Rattray head by about 8 o'clock, which is when there should be slack water. And that's because there's a race around Rattray head, and if it's slack water we can go a little bit closer in and so have a little bit of a shorter journey. That's the lighthouse over there that shows Rattray head, about 7 miles away. So that's Rattray head there. Got a little bit of wind helping us along. 700 or so watts, going at 4.6 knots. Torqeedo's powering away there. Unfortunately, the winds dropped right down, and so I've had to turn the Torqeedo on. I'm doing 2.7 knots, just under 400 watts of power. We don't have much capacity in the battery, so I'll keep it at very low power at the moment and hope the wind picks up soon. Got about 400 watts going into the Torqeedo, doing 2.6 knots, and just around this corner should be the lock that takes us up there in between those mountains. So this is with about 1,000 watts of Torqeedo on a completely calm day going through a canal, and we have around about 3.5 knots we're doing, 3.5 or 3.6 knots. So now we're going at 4.1 knots with again no wind and about 900 watts of this Torqeedo. The reason we're going up 4 knots is we have 260 watts going into the other Torqeedo, this 8-0 one at the back. So we're running both on a little under half power. Coming up to foyers here, doing about 2.5 knots. And these are the engines that are doing the work. This one's got about 150 watts going into it. That one about 300 watts. And they're pushing us along at 2.5 knots into a slight headwind. So we're doing 2.5 knots now. We've got 2 Torqeedos going in with about 500 watts. But what I'm realizing is every knot of reduced headwind speeds us up by about 0.1 of a knot. So this goes along with the previous reckoning of 10 knots of headwind being similar to 1 adverse knot of tide. Well, the wind's died down now to pretty much nothing, so we've put the spinnaker away and we're just motoring with the one electric motor down to Fort Augustus, which is just over there. We should be there in about half an hour. We're doing about 2.5 knots. This is just to show that on a calm canal with no wind at 1,200 watts you do about 4 knots. It looks like that's it. 4.8 knots is the maximum speed for the Torqeedo 2.0 on a 3-ton sailboat in really calm waters. What it's doing at the back. Okay, it's the big test now. Got both motors running. It's almost no wind. Dawn on Loch Lochy. How fast can we go? So I'll turn this one up to full power. It's nearly 2.3 kilowatts, passing 4 knots. Have to compensate with the steering because we're steering to the side. 4.5 knots. 4.8. I'll turn this one up a bit as well. So we're go up to 300 watts. 375 watts. That's about 2.2 kilowatts. Got 4.9 knots. Can we get to the elusive 5 knots? Yes! We got to 5 knots. So that's with 2.2 kilowatts going through this one, and 350 watts, 370 watts going through the other one. 5 knots. So that's at just over 2.5 kilowatts, maybe 2.6 kilowatts. Let's calm it down again. Turn this one down as well. There we go. Back to a more sensible speed. Still at 4 knots. That will be going down to 3 knots or so. Whew. 5 knots. Dawn on Lake Lockheed. And actually, there's a bit of a headwind now. That might have been into a bit of a headwind. Let's see what it says. 3.8 knots, so well, maybe 1 or 2 knots of headwind, which actually makes quite a difference. Each knot of headwind makes about 0.1 of a knot of our speed, so maybe could have gone even faster.